Imagine the center of the ancient world just, going up in flames. And to save his own skin, the most powerful man on earth points a finger at this tiny, deeply misunderstood cult.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens when a dictator's perfect scapegoat strategy just spectacularly backfires?
Well, you get a historical flashpoint, one that didn't just rattle an empire, but, I mean, it essentially set the cultural and legal trajectory of Western civilization.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a massive stack of sources today covering the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64
Right.
and Emperor Nero's violent scapegoating of the early Christians, who are often referred to as the Roman Protomartyrs.
Which is a term we'll definitely get into.
Yeah, we will. Plus, we're looking at the incredibly intense debates over the ancient texts that actually recorded all this because, historians love to argue.
Oh, they really do.
So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out the mechanics of this clash. Like, how did a single catastrophic urban disaster spark this 2,000-year legacy? A legacy that echoes from, ancient execution arenas all the way to modern architecture and even 20th century political philosophy.
It is a massive scope. But to really grasp the persecution itself, we have to start with the sheer scale of the trigger event.
Right.
Because we often hear the phrase, the Great Fire of Rome, but the reality of July AD 64 was, well, it was apocalyptic.
Just totally devastating.
Yeah. So Rome was divided into 14 Augustan municipal districts. And this fire, it burned continuously for 9 days.
9 days? Wait, just unstoppable for over a week.
Right. It completely gutted 3 of those districts, left absolutely nothing but ash. And it severely damaged 7 others.
Wow. 9 days of uncontrollable fire in a densely populated ancient metropolis. Because, our sources point out that Rome wasn't just, grand marble temples.
No, not at all.
It was largely made up of these tightly packed, multi-story wooden tenements. So once the fire caught in those narrow streets, the wind just pushed it.
Yeah.
It became an unstoppable inferno.
Precisely. And almost immediately, the public narrative turns against Emperor Nero because rumors start to spread that he intentionally ordered the city burned.
Really? Like an inside job?
Yeah, the rumor was he did it just to clear out real estate so he could build his domiceria, his massive golden house palace.
Okay. Which brings up a detail we actually have to clarify for you listening, because we all know that famous phrase, right? Nero fiddled while Rome burned.
Oh, yeah. The classic image.
Right. But the sources are pretty clear that this is a total invention.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, the fiddle didn't even exist yet.
Right.
The classical legend claims he stood in his stage costume, playing the lyre, singing this epic poem about the sack of Troy while he just watched his capital burn.
Which is very cinematic, but...
Very cinematic. But historical accounts indicate Nero wasn't even in Rome.
Oh,
yeah, he was miles away at his coastal villa in Antium when the blaze actually started.
okay, let's unpack this. Because even if he wasn't standing there striking the match himself, he returns to a city in ruins, and he faces the ultimate political nightmare.
Exactly.
Think of like a modern politician caught in a massive career-ending scandal. They don't just sit there and deny it, They have to try and dominate the news cycle with something louder.
Right.
They deploy this massive distraction strategy to shift the media narrative away from their own culpability.
And that is exactly the playbook Nero used. He didn't have social media, obviously. So his version of dominating the news cycle was rolling out what the Romans called piacula.
Piacula. Okay, let's break that down because that sounds like a highly technical term. What does a piacula actually look like on the ground on the streets of Rome?
Well, think of it as an elaborate, highly visible cult ritual designed to essentially buy back the favor of the gods, because the Romans believed the fire was a sign of divine wrath. So Nero organized these massive animal sacrifices, public banquets, and cult propitiation.
Just throwing a huge spectacle.
Basically, yeah, to prove to the populace that he was fixing the cosmic imbalance. And he also lavished cash and gifts on the public.
But according to the text, none of it works,
Yeah.
right? The public just isn't buying the PR spin.
No, they're not.
This infamia, this sinister, unshakable rumor that he ordered the fire himself, it just won't die.
So he pivots to the oldest trick in the book. He finds a scapegoat.
Right.
He needed a group that the Roman public already disliked and distrusted, and he finds the perfect target in this tiny, emerging minority group, the Christians.
Which, we have to put ourselves in the mindset of an average Roman citizen in the first century to really understand why the Christians were such an easy target here.
Definitely.
Because it wasn't just that they were new, it was their secretive behavior, specifically regarding their religious rights.
Yeah, The early Christians met in private homes, often secretly, which in a highly regulated empire inherently breeds suspicion.
Right. The state wants to know what you're doing.
Always. But the real issue was this profound misunderstanding of their actual rituals, because the Christians partook in the Eucharist, right? Where they spoke of consuming the body and blood of Christ.
Oh, yeah. If you are an uncomprehending Roman citizen overhearing that a secret group is gathering to eat flesh and drink blood.
Your mind goes to the darkest possible place.
Exactly.
It sparked these horrifying rumors of ritual infanticide and cannibalism. They were viewed literally as enemies of humanity. So when Nero points the finger at them for the fire, the public is already primed to believe it.
They're ready to hate them. But knowing that Nero tried to scapegoat them doesn't really answer our biggest problem, which is, how do we actually know what happened next?
Right, the sourcing.
Yeah, because Nero's own imperial records wouldn't advertise a failed PR stunt. So we have to look outside his administration, which takes us to a really foundational piece of ancient text.
Yes. We turn to the Roman historian Tacitus, specifically his major work called the Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44.
Annals 15.44.
Exactly. And this is a monumental text because it is the earliest reference to Christians in Roman historiography.
Wow.
Tacitus explicitly confirms that a figure named Christus was executed by the Roman authorities in Judea during the reign of Emperor Tiberius.
And Tacitus then goes on to detail the horrific tortures that Nero inflicted on this group in Rome. And I mean, he paints a picture of just a theatrical circus of horrors.
He really was.
It wasn't just a matter of standard executions. Tacitus writes that Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by wild dogs.
Yeah.
They were nailed to crosses.
And perhaps most notoriously, they were doomed to the flames. They were tied to stakes and burned alive to serve as human torches, literally providing nighttime illumination for Nero's own gardens.
That is horrifying.
The brutal. Nero even opened up his personal gardens for this spectacle and paraded around the Vatican circus dressed as a charioteer, just mingling with the crowd.
It's an unimaginable level of cruelty. But if Nero's goal was to unify the Roman public in hatred against this scapegoat, Tacitus points out a fascinating shift that happens.
What's fascinating here is the psychological backfire of Nero's cruelty.
Yeah.
Because Tacitus notes that while the Roman public initially hated the Christians and, believed they deserved extreme punishment for their perceived abominations, the sheer relentless sadism of Nero's spectacle changed the mood.
Really?
Yeah. The crowd's hatred slowly morphed into compassion.
Because it becomes obvious to the everyday Roman that these people aren't being destroyed for the public good or to punish arsonists. Tacitus explicitly says they were being destroyed to glut one man's cruelty.
Exactly. But here is where we have to pause and look at the historiographical debate.
Ah, yes. The skeptics.
Right, because this specific text, Annals 15.44, provides such a foundational non-Christian confirmation of Jesus in the early church, it has been a massive target for skeptics.
Makes sense.
For centuries, historians have fiercely debated whether this passage is actually authentic to Tacitus, or if it's a later forgery slipped into the manuscript by a Christian scribe trying to legitimize their own history.
And the detective work on this is just wild. We really need to explore the arguments from both sides of the aisle here. So let's start with the skeptics.
Okay.
One of the biggest red flags they point to is the specific title that Tacitus uses. He refers to Pontius Pilate, the man who executed Christus, as a procurator.
Right, which was generally accepted until modern archaeology stepped in. In 1961, archaeologists in Judea discovered what is now known as the Pilate Stone.
The Pilate Stone.
Yeah, it's a limestone block bearing an inscription that clearly titles Pilate as a prefect, not a procurator.
See, to a casual reader, prefect versus procurator might just sound like semantics. Why would a historian of Tacitus's caliber care about that distinction? And why does getting it wrong suggest a forgery?
Well, in Roman bureaucracy, the distinction is highly significant. A prefect is primarily a military governor, whereas a procurator is primarily a financial administrator.
Oh, I see.
And Tacitus was a Roman senator himself. He was known for being incredibly punctilious about administrative titles.
He wouldn't make that mistake.
Exactly. Skeptics argue that making a basic historical blunder like that is highly suspicious. It looks a lot more like a later writer making an assumption based on the terminology of their own time.
Right. And then there is the physical manuscript itself. The oldest surviving copy of this text is the Medicean manuscript in Florence, which dates back to the 11th century.
Yes.
Wait, so you're telling me historians are looking at an 11th century parchment just to see if someone messed with the ink?
They absolutely are. And under ultraviolet light, you can actually see an erasure. The text originally had an E, which was later altered to an I.
Why does one vowel matter so much?
Because it changes the word from Christians to Christians. Skeptics argue the text originally referred to followers of a completely different troublemaker in Rome named Chrestus, and a Christian copyist later altered the E to an I to hijack the passage for their own religion.
Wow.
Furthermore, modern scholars like Brent Shaw argue that Nero never persecuted Christians at all. Shaw claims Tacitus was just relying on later Christian legends that retroactively made Nero into this ultimate antichrist figure.
Shaw also points out a glaring silence in the historical record, doesn't he?
He does.
Like not a single Christian writer cited this highly useful, validating passage from Tacitus until Sulpicius Severus in the 5th century.
Which is strange.
Right. If you were an early Christian apologist trying to prove your religion is real, why wouldn't you quote the most famous Roman historian to back up your claims? It's a really compelling argument for the skeptics.
It is compelling, but we also have to look at the other side, because the overwhelming scholarly consensus today actually still holds that the passage is authentic.
Okay, so how do they counter the forgery arguments? What's the defense?
Well, first, they look at the Latin syntax. Linguists and Latin experts argue that the vocabulary, the rhythm, and the sentence structure flawlessly match Tacitus's highly distinct, concise style.
It's hard to fake that.
Very hard. Forgeries usually feature exaggerated mannerisms or slightly clunky phrasing that gives them away, but this passage flows perfectly.
And there's also a psychological argument regarding the language used, right?
Exactly. Tacitus calls Christianity a mischievous and destructive superstition. The Latin is exitiabilis superstitio. He says they were hated for their shameful acts.
So if a Christian monk in the Middle Ages forged this to validate their religion, they'd have to be playing an incredibly complex game of reverse psychology.
Right.
Like, why write something so intensely pejorative about yourself?
Exactly. As for the procurator issue, scholars argue there are simple explanations. By the time Tacitus was writing his history, which was decades after the events, the title procurator had become the standard term for that governing role.
So you just use the modern word for it.
Right. He may have simply retrojected the current terminology into the past. Or he might have been influenced by Latin translations of the Gospel of Luke, which used a general term for administrator.
Okay, I understand the linguistic defense.
Yeah.
But I have to push back on one specific detail in the text itself that really bothers me.
Sure. What is it?
Tacitus mentions that an initial arrest was made of those who pleaded guilty or offered premature confessions to starting the fire.
Yes.
If the Christians didn't start the fire, why on earth did some of them confess to it? That feels like a massive hole in the narrative.
It's a very natural question to ask, but historians look at how people behave under extreme pressure, and they point to historical parallels.
Like what?
Take the Great Fire of London in 1666. A Frenchman named Robert Hubert confessed to starting that fire. He gave details, he was tried, and he was hanged.
Yeah.
Catch? He wasn't even in England when the fire started.
Oh, wow. I guess if you're dragged into a Roman dungeon and subjected to brutal interrogation, you might just say whatever they want to hear to make the pain stop.
Exactly. Frenzied, terrifying times produce false confessions. Panic sets in.
Yeah.
Alternatively, some historians suggest a different psychological mechanism entirely. The early church was swept up in intense apocalyptic fervor. Some believers, when questioned by authorities, might have actively sought out martyrdom.
Just proudly associating themselves with the group.
Right. Refusing to deny their affiliation, which the Romans then interpreted as a confession of guilt for the fire.
Which moves us organically from the cold, hard historical debates about the texts into the psychology of the people involved.
Yes, the human element.
Because it is one thing to give a false confession under duress in a dungeon. It is another thing entirely to maintain your faith as you are being tied to a stake in the Vatican circus. Why did these ordinary men and women willingly endure such brutal deaths without simply renouncing their faith and, blending back into Roman society?
To understand that, we have to look into the mind of the early martyr, and it actually begins with the etymology of the word itself. Yeah, the Greek root of the word martyr literally translates to witness.
Witness,
yeah.
Okay. And our sources bring in the theological perspective of biblical scholar Scott Hahn to explain how they viewed this witness.
Right.
Hahn points out that these specific Christians in Rome were likely very familiar with St. Paul's letter to the Romans, which had been written to their exact community just a few years prior, around AD 57 or 58.
In that letter, Paul urged the believers to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Now, we have to contrast that with what sacrifice meant in the surrounding culture.
Because it was very different.
Very. In pagan Rome, a sacrifice was transactional. It meant slaughtering an animal and burning it before a stone idol to buy off the gods, much like Nero's Piacula.
Buy off the gods, right. But Hahn argues that the early Christians took Paul's words literally. When they were dragged into the arenas, they viewed their horrific deaths not as a tragic defeat, but as a way of uniting their own physical bodies with Christ's sacrifice on the cross.
Yeah.
It wasn't a transaction. It was an ultimate act of worship.
It's a profound spiritual reframing. This embodies the Catholic theological concept of the Paschal Mystery.
Which is?
The belief that death is not a final end, but a necessary passage to eternal glory. They believe they were actively participating in redemption.
So what does this all mean? We have this tiny, persecuted group facing the unimaginable might of the Roman Empire, armed with nothing but this theology of a living sacrifice. How did this clash impact the subsequent centuries?
Well, Nero's attempt to extinguish the religion essentially set a horrific legal precedent that lasted for 2.5 centuries.
250 years.
Yeah. He established that simply bearing the name Christian or engaging in their secret assemblies was enough to justify the death penalty.
They no longer needed to be accused of a formal crime like arson.
Exactly. The name itself was a crime.
And the sources estimate that between AD 64 and AD 313, which, by the way, is when Emperor Constantine finally legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan, anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 Christians were killed under subsequent emperors like Decius and Diocletian.
But the Roman authorities severely miscalculated human psychology. They hoped terror would erase the movement. Instead, the courage of the martyrs actually drew people in.
That's incredible.
This paradox is famously summarized by the 3rd century theologian Tertullian, who wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church."
And this dynamic of a powerful state trying to crush a spiritual movement isn't just ancient history.
Not at all. You see this dynamic analyzed even in the 20th century. Pope John Paul II wrote about this explicitly in his 1991 encyclical called Centesimus Annus.
Okay.
He was reflecting on modern totalitarian states, and he noted that they inherently attempt to crush the church.
How does a 20th century reflection on totalitarianism connect back to Nero's Rome, though?
Because the core mechanism of absolute power doesn't change. A totalitarian state, by definition, claims absolute authority over everything.
Right.
It cannot tolerate any objective standard of good and evil that sits above the state's power. The Protomartyrs, by refusing to bow to Nero's gods or his narrative, were essentially declaring a limit to state authority.
They were saying, you do not own my soul.
Exactly. And that is a terrifying concept to any dictator, ancient or modern.
And the legacy of those first people who declared that limit is actively honored today. I mean, the Roman proto-martyrs have their own feast day on the Catholic calendar, June 30th.
And the date is very intentional. It's placed the day after the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, linking the everyday, nameless believers with the major apostles.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. To this day, the Vatican holds solemn processions through the very avenues of Vatican City where that blood was originally shed.
There's also a lasting physical legacy in the architecture of Rome itself. In 1968, a titular church called Santi Protomartyri Romani was built, dedicated specifically to these early victims.
It is a fascinating piece of architecture. It features this modernist, neoclassical red brick design, and it's laid out in the shape of a Maltese cross, featuring an octagonal drum and a detached campanile, or bell tower.
That is a lot of specific architectural terminology. What does a building like that actually look like to someone just walking by? And why was it designed that way?
Picture a striking geometric structure where the materials themselves tell the story. The extensive use of red brick is highly evocative. It subtly brings to mind both the flames of AD 64 and the blood of the martyrs.
Oh, wow.
The octagonal drum, which is an 8-sided central structure, is a traditional Christian architectural nod to the 8th day, symbolizing resurrection and eternity.
And the detached bell tower.
It stands like a lone witness. It translates this ancient, gruesome history into a very modern, enduring monument.
That's incredible.
And just for those tracking the hierarchy today, the current cardinal priest of that church is Anthony Pula.
It is the ultimate historical irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
The city that once illuminated its night skies with burning Christians eventually filled its basilicas with their relics, named its streets after them, and built modern architectural monuments to their memory.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, out of the literal ashes of Nero's fire, an entirely new cultural foundation was laid.
It is a staggering journey we've been on today. I mean, we started by exploring the mechanics of a devastating 9-day fire that just gutted the ancient world's greatest metropolis.
Yeah.
We watched a dictator try to dominate the news cycle by scapegoating a misunderstood minority.
We waded through the fiercely debated texts of Tacitus, analyzing military titles and ultraviolet manuscript erasures, all to understand how history is recorded and verified.
And finally, we explored the profound psychological resolve of the living sacrifice, a theological concept that birthed the 2,000-year legacy still celebrated in the streets of Rome today.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought for you to mull over. As we noted from the sources, part of the reason those early Christians were so easily hated by their neighbors was because they were viewed as a menace and disruption to the traditional Roman way of life.
Right. They wouldn't participate in the civic cults. They just didn't fit in.
They were inherently nonconformist.
Exactly.
And it leaves you wondering, when we look back at history's greatest persecutions, how often are they driven not by actual crimes, but by society's deep-seated, violent fear of those who simply refuse to conform to the dominant cultural narrative? When the center of the world goes up in flames, human nature always was for someone to point the finger at. The question is, who are we pointing at today?
That's a powerful thought to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.